So I'm really excited today to introduce to you Soo Rieh. Sue and I worked together when we were at Rutgers. We were collectively known as Milkonites there. It's a private joke, but when Sue left Rutgers, she finished her PhD there, and then she went and worked some at Excite. So she worked for a search engine company for a little while and sort of been on the dark side of things, and then decided to come back over to join us in the academic world. And since then, she's been at the School of Information at the University of Michigan. So I'll turn it over to her.
Okay, wow, this is much larger than expected. I'm so excited, and I hope that you enjoy my talk. And thank you, Diane, and others who invited me. This is really a pleasure to be here today. So I have a really long title, but basically what I'm going to talk today is how people make a credibility judgment in the process of their information seeking. And I'm going to give you the most recent work that I did with my doctoral students. So I put some little things in order to explain that, we all know that every day we are looking for information, and sometimes a lot of information are coming to you. So we constantly have to sort of select information, throughout different channels and media and so on. For the past 10 years or so, I've been specifically interested in how when people encounter certain information, how they obtain certain information with certain intentions, how they make a judgment about information. So I guess that this audience will know that people, first thing that comes to their mind is like how useful this is. So that has been sort of discussed in the literature in terms of like relevance. I think that when I began my doctoral dissertation study, that's when the web was still new. So I became increasingly interested in, okay, this is a quite different kind of information. In this context, how people make sure that this information is really good enough. So that was my earlier work that I published in JCS 2002, Information Quality and Cognitive Authority Issues. So there are all kinds of things in people's mind, how useful this is, whether this is really good enough, is this something that I can really trust? Or is this information really, influencing other people's opinion and so on? So I sort of put this. This is my operationalized, very brief, definition is like whether you can trust it or not. I say that's like a sort of credibility issues. Whether that information influence your thoughts, that's a cognitive authority that I would, that I cite actually Patrick Wilson's second-hand knowledge, where he had a sort of a theory about cognitive authority. No, not this one, wrong mouse. Anyway, increasingly I find that credibility actually has been discussed not only in information science field. It actually has been discussed in all these different disciplines, and I just named only a few. What's interesting is that people have a different sort of perspective, different definitions. They've been interested in little different issues as well. They very actually cross-reference each other. So most of this definition of perspective about credibility has been really field-specific. It's been only really recent that communication researcher and information scientists, for example, and health science folks, we actually had a book together about the credibility in digital media. So for the first time, actually, these people who actually go all different conferences and who actually have published all different venues actually got together, and then we actually have a pretty interesting discussion group going on. But until recently, it's been really field-specific issue. As I briefly mentioned, how people make a judgment about information has been discussed in the framework of relevance. Information science has been interested in for the past 30, 40 years, relevance. A really long time, until 80s and early, I guess even 90s, this relevance has been understood in terms of a topic. I'm looking for information about usability. This is usability. This must be relevant to this person's topic. Later on, Linda Schoenberg, Carol Berry, Taemin Kim Park, there are a number of different dissertations in Indiana and Syracuse. They actually realized that it's much more broader than just the topic. People actually pay attention when this was published, what kind of journal this has been published? Do I know this author? You know, is this really novel? This is present accurate information. So they identified all these different user-centered criteria that influence people's relevance judgments. I am particularly sort of claimed in my earlier studies and still now that in this web environment, credibility or whether you can actually trust this information or not, because anyone can really post information without any really quality control mechanism like a reference system, or you need to hire publisher to get published. I was interested in this, and there has been actually, we have a much shorter history paying attention to credibility issues in information science compared to, for example, communication. Communication field, interestingly enough, they have been interested in this whole source credibility. So typically they were interested in when you got the same news from TV, newspaper, magazine, which one you got sort of conflicting information. Which one you would trust most? And when they say source, actually it tends to be more like a speaker. So you have a real life feeling through TV and newspaper, which one you trust more. So they've been traditionally interested in this issue, and then when the web came along, they simply added one more category. Are you interested in information, like do you tend to trust more information from the web? But web is much more complicated, right? It's like a CNN, the same information is coming to you through the web, and then they show the video clip, and then you can look at that in the TV. So it's basically the same information from the same source. So this line between what's really source and what's really message and what's really media, that has become much more complicated recently. I realized that actually it's not just communication and information science. There are other areas who also have been sort of dealing with these issues. For example, MIS area, you get the information, expert system, okay? I don't know what, and then you search something, and then it gives you all these statistics and some trends for the past 10 years or 20 years. Human judgment versus facts or advice or recommendation from system. Which one you trust more? When your employee is telling you that this is what I have been thinking, my own judgment, versus I got this data from the system, managers, boss, do they trust which one? So there are quite a number of research going on, I realized more recently looking at that. Consumer behavior, of course, they have been interested in these credibility issues, because when they put any advertisement, of course we don't believe everything. This is the best car in the world, and there are some claims that people actually consider that they must be true when it says, certain mileage or, reliability, but there are certain really just a selling point. This will last forever, or lifelong warranty. So people have to sort of consider what's really objective information and what's really sort of the marketing term. And they have become interested in how people make such judgment so that they can mix a little bit. So it doesn't sound like, whole just a show. They include some facts, but they really present in a different way compared to news or scholarly information, for example. Now, the online setting, people actually prove, that their recommendations. I used this and it works well, kind of thing. So they also have been interested in it. To what extent do people really actually trust other people's recommendation that, most of them you don't know who they are even. And health science, naturally, they have become interested in this issue. What's interesting is that those articles written by doctors, they are really concerned about information quality. Their concern is that they are so afraid that consumers would get wrong information. So their credibility has been more like a really accuracy. Is this really authoritative information from doctors versus this is from sort of a layman? And I had a nice talk with Jarrod before, that people actually have just a different way of accepting those information. Not necessarily, the information from doctor is always credible versus the ordinary people's experience information is not necessarily. It's also very complicated issues there. But I am in information science area, so I'm focusing on credibility judgment in the context of like information seeking process. So I feel like I need some sort of definition. This is how I started. So based on my previous work, I claim that people tend to recognize information trustworthy when they see certain evidence that source has a expertise. Okay, expertise can be this person is a professor in UNC. This person is an MD. This person is an author of 10 books. So a lot of times it can be individual credentials or like a UNC professor. So it can come from institution or it's from CNN. So people see some evidence in terms of source expertise, and then they are more likely believe that this information is trustworthy. So that's how I sort of made my scope after reviewing all these credibility issues across different fields. So this is what I did like last year. I was my work, I was interested in people's assessment of credibility in the web setting. So when you find certain information through web search engine or you go to certain websites and find information, on what basis you can really can be assured that this is a credible information. This study, I sort of extended that a little, and I realized that actually, although internet really boosts people's interest in credibility, prior to the internet, when you read newspaper, when you read just articles, actually this is something that has been going on in people's mind. So for this particular study, I sort of extended the scope a little bit, and then really their daily life, when they get information from all kinds of different media, including the web, but also including this conversation, when they get the information through books or library, how they make credibility assessments. And I really want to include people's what kind of goals they were looking had, and what kind of task particularly they were looking for in this particular information activity. So my really purpose of this study was really trying to look at the relationship between credibility assessment and information seeking. So what I did was that I recruited, this is a small scale exploratory study. So I recruited at beginning 26 college students, and 2 dropped in the middle, so I ended up getting actually 24 subjects. What I asked them is that we actually had an orientation session with individual, and then we gave them instructions. What I did was that I didn't really tell them that I'm interested in credibility. I was telling them that we are interested in sort of college student information seeking behavior. What they did was that we made this password protected this kind of website, and we gave them login and password. Every single day for 10 days, they come and then they were asked to write most important information episode they had that day. So it's not just anyone, but a lot of students actually reported entertainment kind of information as well, although we said important. So we had this it was important to them, who got married, who had a baby. So these are the things that I included in that particular activity diary. What did you need to know? How familiar are you? What are you looking for? What resources did you turn to? And how did you go about? How much time did you spend? What are you going to do now? Now that you get the information, how are you going to really use that? And then, also we were gathering their difficulty and confidence and familiarity kind of scale, kind of questions. So once they have this one, what we did was that 10 days, I told you that actually out of 26, only 2 dropped for 10 days. So I think that was pretty, it went okay. We printed out pages. So each episode was usually printed out about 1 page. So we printed out, made 2 copies, and then we brought that to the interview. So we all went through, interviewer and interviewee, went through the interview, their activities. And then we started asking questions about general their information seeking strategy as well as their credibility assessment. How much they were concerned, how can they make sure that this is actually credible or not. And what's actually interesting is that we actually really didn't use much this diary. Actually, this data were really served for the interview, helping them, like recollect what was going on. And then, although we of course said in the instruction that please provide the information as much as you can, they say they put like 1 or 2 resources. When you actually started talking, they realized there were actually a few more steps. They went after that, but they sort of put some clue. But it was still very helpful. Oh, did I do that? Oh, now I remember. Rather than just completely rely on their retrospective ideas, I think that this was a good sort of evidence to remind them. So these are the kind of questions we asked during the interview. So although remember my purpose was that really trying to understand the credibility in the context of information seeking. So I was really trying to understand their search process, how it went, and whether credibility really came up when they were looking for information. And if that came out, we really probe in a way that what do you mean by that? When they say, I trusted this information, and how do you know that? What do you mean by that? So we are really trying to really dig in their conceptions about credibility. So there is some information about like who they were. I actually, so like at the beginning we were focusing on first-year students, and because of it, we sort of claim that these are the folks who really grow up. These are the folks that actually, when internet started, they were first grader. So I was really interested in the particular, but it was very hard to just focus on freshmen because we were actually recruiting students from community college and other colleges as well. So it was like end up actually mixed. About half of them are freshmen, the other were just seniors and so on. So that's why we have 11, 18-year-old students. So it's just sort of mixed up in terms of gender and in terms of their major. So this is like a typical sort of qualitative study. I transcribed the whole interview, and then we went through like a sort of iteration process of like doing content analysis. And these are the sort of major categories that I came up with. Goal, task, and resource, and their strategy, and then their judgment of credibility, of course. So I'm going to give you some of the major findings, and then I'm going to talk about the framework that I came up with, and I will make sure that we have enough sort of Q&A time, because that's going to be helpful for me. So basically, I was trying to see the relationship between their goal and their credibility assessment. Not surprisingly, when they have a certain homework to do, academic achievement or problem solving, they were more concerned about credibility than, who is divorcing whom, kind of entertainment information. But what's actually interesting, this whole personal interest category that we came up with, it's not necessarily they were always more concerned for their homework than actually their personal interest. They were actually more interested in credibility when they have to spend money, than homework. What eventually came up with was that when they find information, if they know that this information is going to be used by someone else, I am getting gift for my mom, then I'm really carefully reading all these recommendations and rates and others. Or I am actually, my friend is recently diagnosed with some certain health. So I want to sort of find some information for her or him, not for me. They're actually much more concerned about credibility. So there is a little social, I think that aspect came along that somehow if this is just my grade, my homework, I want to make sure how professor would evaluate my work. But if this is someone that influenced by my information seeking, they really want to make sure that this is credible information or not. This predictive judgment and evaluative judgment is something that I found earlier in my dissertation study, where I did an experimental study how people evaluate information when they find information from websites. So what's happening was that there is a certain default that you want to start with, right? So which page you want to go. when they choose Google over Yahoo, there is a certain reason for that. When they choose CNN over weather.com for even weather, there got to be some reason for that. Anyway, people have a sort of prediction and certain expectation, and they carry over that expectation when they actually evaluate information, when they actually looking at the information. Now, what I was able to add was this whole verification, which was really interesting, and I think that that's partly because I gathered the data through multiple resources in Medium rather than just narrowing down to the web. So what was going on is that they called their mom about gardening. And then mom is telling you something. I go to website, make sure. Or vice versa. Actually, I studied the web. I'm not sure which one is the better one. I go to professor and ask questions. So they do certain verification across different media. Web, digital information is always there. But what I'm saying is that it really doesn't exclude people's human interaction, all these habits that you tend to ask your friends before you go to librarian. It's still there. It's just that they want to get information from multiple different sources and verify information. Another thing that I found interesting was that, okay, this is something that I already told you a little. They do not really start any random. They may have a certain default site in their web browser, but they actually, a lot of times, they ask people first. I have this kind of problem. Where should I start? And then, since I trust this person, I go to website and start from there. So a lot of this online, offline interaction is going on. This is also something that I already indicated a little bit. People actually use they prefer to use different media or resources, and they feel comfortable when completely different resources is telling you the same story. Also, this is probably interesting as well, is that I know that if I send an email and I wait 2 days, I will have a better information. But I cannot wait 2 days. So I'm gonna I know that this is a little obscure, I'm not quite sure about the credibility, but I'm gonna just take the information. So it's not big deal, this kind of information test, if I get not so credible information, it's not gonna really affect me tremendously. So there is like a credibility, this relatively young people, it's not like they do not consider or completely ignore, but like one person's quote was that, I want to get best information in a quickest way. It's really their goal. But a lot of times they actually would compromise the best part for quickest way part. So this is, I'm sort of switching the gear a little bit, and this is like a framework that I was able to come up with based on this data analysis, and this is obviously separate paper. So what I found was that when people, a lot of researchers in information science and communication and health also, they always ask people, do you think that this is credible? Can you trust this information? And sometimes they use this Likert scale 1 to 5. And do you think that this is objective, trustworthy, non-biased, and so on? There is no really good way of understanding how this whole credibility judgment is embedded on the information seeking, and sort of like a whole picture. I was trying to really get a whole picture of what really credibility judgment means to people. So I realized that actually there are 4 different levels that I can sort of distinguish. One is that most sort of like, let me show this one actually. So this is information that you just encounter. And there is like an information seeker this way, and this is more like an information object way. Okay, so what's going on is that when people tend to have a certain their own construct and conceptualization of credibility. To some people, objectivity is more important. To some people, I can trust that this information is more important. To some people, whether this is telling me the truth or not. So people have a different sort of conceptualization of like what credibility means to them. At the same time, one person, depending on the goals, they have a different way of judging as well. It's like health information, accuracy is more important. News information, currency is more important, for example. And other times, trustworthy is more important. The second level that I'm presenting here is heuristics. So this is has been sort of found in previous study, but I was able to articulate a little better. This is that people tend to believe, yeah, I tend to like information from .edu, .com. This is a medical doctor, so when it says that this information was written by a medical doctor, I tend to trust. So they have this rule of thumb. In general, I trust my professors in my school, okay? Then there is like a context level, which was that, oh, this is like for my mom. This is for my homework. So this is like a school related. So what's important here is that if it's a school related, they say, oh, my professor wouldn't like if I have a bunch of links from the website. So I gotta include some books. I don't particularly really think that books are more credible than websites, but professor would prefer that, so I would put that. Or I tend to trust my professor for this particular course. But when I actually buy some other things, I'm not going to ask my professor what the best digital camera is, for example, right? So they actually have this boundary. In this boundary, I tend to trust this person. I tend to trust this website, and so on. So that's just like what I mean by context. And then there is an interaction level, which is something that, oh, this design looks cool, so I like this website. Or I trust information from this website because this is really professionally designed. Or this particular, I generally believe information from EDU site, but God, this information has a lot of errors and so on. So in the case, so this is much more specific. Very one specific information piece and source, they actually make a judgment. So what's interesting here is that these four levels are sort of like interplaying each other. So when they have the same experience over and over in interaction, it's like well-designed information are not necessarily giving me information. This is my second time to get this. Then it becomes their heuristic. So they actually use that. Or they say that I tend to trust my professor in general, but this particular professor, I'm not going to trust because like the last time she told me this and I check out and it was wrong information. So they have this general rule, but they make an exception. But if they have this experience and over, they tend to change their heuristics. So heuristics tend to sort of evolve in that sense. So it's the same thing that they're constructed. I tend to rely on really objectivity information, but I realize that that's not the whole story. Sometimes you have to check out this kind of aspect as well. So these four levels sort of interact each other. What also I found interesting is that these heuristics, for example, it really provides a shortcut. Now that they have this rule of thumb, I know where I should go. So I tend to go. Not heuristics always really apply every single interaction sections, right? But generally, that really gives you an effective way to find the information. Also, context is really helping you to limit the information. Since this is a school-related stuff, I tend to trust this kind of information over the other. Since this is like entertainment or sports that I've been following, I know exactly what I'm doing. So in that context, I actually trust myself, or my friend knows much more. So context is also like more like a domain that people actually relate their credibility assessment into their context. So, but eventually interaction is something that, so sometimes when I'm saying that they are really concerned about credibility, I think that they tend to pay attention to all of this. If they don't really care that much, much, they start almost here and not really paying attention individual. So it's like, it's going to be really, life is going to be so difficult, I guess, the time consuming. Every time you see certain information, should I trust this information? Who is the author? It's designed well. People don't do that. People have a sort of a general rule of thumb, but depending on the task, if this is a really important task or they somehow see some red flag, then they pay attention to interaction level. So these are sort of in and out. Sometimes all these four were really explicitly mentioned by my subject. Sometimes actually they pay attention to one level over another kind of thing. So I want to actually hear some feedback about this model, because this is something that I'm still sort of working on a little. So this is how I presented graphically. So I have like 2 papers. If you need more information, feel free to send me an email, and then I will be happy to share that. The talk ended a little earlier than I thought, but we have plenty of time for questions. Diane, do you want me to talk more? I can talk a little more.
Oh, well, looks like we have some questions. So. Go ahead, yes.
Could you bring the slides to the model that has different layers? I was actually wondering about, because you mentioned the peripheral source cues at the interaction level, and I was wondering what's your take on the central route of persuasion in terms of the seeker's information seeking? Is that more at the construct level, or it's like permeated throughout the 4 levels already?
So construct level is more like their own sort of definition of credibility. This one, actually, now I know why I have a little more time. The interaction level, actually, there are 3 ways how people actually make assessment about in terms of interaction. One is content, the message itself, what this is telling me. A lot of times, if they do not feel, they are not really knowledgeable enough, they are not familiar with the topic, they then tend to rely on peripheral cues, which is that peripheral source cues is something like this person is a doctor, this is from UNC faculty, this is has some URL like .edu or .org. So they sort of look at all these source-related peripheral cues and rely on them. They make an information judgment. Another sort of category is a peripheral information object cues. So that's much more, it's much more like a design. It's a presentation. It's an organization. And they sort of sometimes rely on those. So interaction level, it's not always really about the content. It's about these different categories. And what's going on is that I think that depending on the topic, how familiar they are, how knowledgeable, or how they feel confident about evaluating information, if they are more like that, they tend to rely on content cues. Otherwise, peripheral cues play a role there.
I'm not sure how you would fit this in the case of, for instance, receiving contradictory information. I'm wondering to what extent path dependency would come in. Like, what did you see first, and would that fit within this model? I mean, sort of questions of how they get ideas about credibility based either on the order in which they've looked at the different contradictory information, or even perhaps based on, I'm thinking now in a web context, you may actually be reading news that now has comments, and you may see 15 comments that are very positive towards a story, followed by 10 comments that are negative, or vice versa, and wondering whether that kind of the existence of path dependency might be there, and if so, whether that would fit into this and how.
That's a really good question. I think that that comes to like two are related. I think that that's one whether a person tends to actually sort of trust other people's sort of comments. I tend to do that. That's more like a heuristic, but do you actually read them and then see how their thoughts are any differ from your own judgment. I think that sort of comes down to interaction. And also, I forgot to mention that in terms of the predictive judgment, evaluative judgment, and then verification, there are two ways of that sort of triggers their verification. One is that they almost like at the same time they see two conflicting information. So they sort of try to find out, like a third source to make sure that which one actually is a right kind of information. More often, what's going on is that they sort of assume that this must be good information, and then later on, a few days later, they hear something else, and they sort of go back. Oh, I thought that it was like A. Maybe my interpretation, my understanding must be wrong. So they sort of go back. So it's not really all this like a verification is not necessarily really simultaneous. It can be there is like some temporal issue going on. It can be really over time they go back and they change their mind about the credibility. So that's why I think that it's important to see this kind of credibility in a more natural setting, because when I was doing experimental study, that kind of aspect was really hard to capture. Yes.
This actually leads in pretty nicely. Did you see any evidence that the people doing the seeking were using some sort of internal, like belief calculus or like crude Bayesian updating, or any, or implicitly, even if not explicitly, were they behaving as if they were behaving rationally?
Okay, that's a good question. I think that I think that at least my subject, this is qualitative studies, small scale study. So what I can just tell for my subject who participated in my study, they were able to articulate their cognitive process fairly well. But you need to do a little good job in terms of interviewing, because like when you ask people directly, so when you look for this information, didn't really credibility issues come up in your mind? They say, not really. Then I ask them, okay, let's talk about your information seeking episode, and why did you start from there? Then people say, oh, that's because I trust my mom, because she's been doing gardening for 20 years. So she's an expert in that area. So it's like I don't know whether this is directly related to your question, but it's like they were able to really see why they chose this person, why they chose, decide to go that way. They were able to at least explicitly mention that.
Rephrase like a second part of it. It's more like looking at the interaction level and the changing of the heuristics over time. Did they ever, like when they were changing their minds, did they say a piece of evidence that made it more plausible or less plausible, even just at the qualitative level?
They were able to almost like quantify.
As they got more evidence, or even just qualified, this made it more credible, this made it less credible. New evidence as it came in.
I think that they did. There was not really something that I was really focusing on. I was just trying to just capture, what are there, rather than really which one actually they rely on more than others. Yes.
I think I brought my entire reference class here, so it's actually my fault that the room is so crowded. But I feel compelled, therefore, to relate this back to reference work. So you're talking about that within certain bounds, your respondents trust this source or that person within certain contexts. Did any of your respondents go to libraries, talk to reference librarians in particular, and what were the bounds within which they did that?
That's actually the separate paper that I'm going to present in ACES.
Excellent.
ACES conference, you will actually see that I almost like numerically really broke down the kinds of resources they rely on for this 245 information seeking episode. My memory has been that not many students really went to librarian. They rely on, but this is good news, they rely on human resources a lot. And it's like, I think that depending on, I broke down, so like academic kind of information seeking, problem solving, personal interest, routine, and there must be one more category that I cannot really remember. And then especially for academic problems and then problem solving, especially for problem solving, they actually went to a person. Not necessarily librarian, but they still use their friend, family, and the person that I know. And then it's like, especially for problem solving, for example, 40% they rely on still human resources. And online searching, in terms of online resources, actually surprisingly, they didn't use search engines a lot. They actually go to websites and then started from there. So the percentage that I barely remember, but it's around only 10% or something. That actually people rely on the search engine. But again, this is a small sample, and I asked them important information seeking episodes, so it may be really biased in terms of that. But I was really surprised by number of, to what extent actually students rely on search engine. There was one very small story in the whole picture. So.
I'm curious about so you had to do the diary, and then you said that when they came in, there were other details that they remembered about the search after you got talking to them. Did you look at all, or do you have any sense of what they remembered versus what they actually wrote in the diary?
I really didn't analyze that, okay. But I can say that since I did a lot of interviews, I can say that students, these participants, were not able to, not able to really remember. It's like when they telling me the story, they use actually 5 to 6 different resources.
Right.
They wrote about 2 or 3. They remember about 1.
Okay.
And then they said, oh, that's how I did. I went to Google and then I searched for something and I got the answer. And then I was saying that, but it says that after Google, actually you went to these two different other sites as well. They say, oh, yeah, right. Now I remember. And then they were telling me more story. And then I said, okay, well, so what happened next? And then realized that actually on the same day or next day, they go back to the same task and they continue to do searching. But of course, they didn't. They never go back to old diary. They're trying to add more, right? So it's like, but I was not really, that's a really interesting aspect, how much they can remember.
I'll talk with you about that after.
Right. Okay.
Did you happen to see any trends about the personal characteristics of their background, so different ways that like men or women or anything else in their background would affect looking at the websites and their credibility or anything like that?
Since this is such a small sample, I think that I really didn't analyze data that way. Yeah, but I have seen some studies that whether really the communication, they tend to do sort of a survey, questionnaire. Actually most of the studies find some gender differences, for example, and then I think that I cannot remember one way or the other. But I'm sorry, I cannot really remember whether women was more likely to trust information. I think that men are more likely trust information in general. But again, they were interested in mostly sort of what's called relative media credibility. So they were just comparing information from different sources. So, okay, Carol, and then you're next.
I was just curious what your sense was of how often you thought they were wrong, in the sense that they were basing their interactional decisions, they're articulating to you, well, I loved that it had jazzy JavaScript or whatever, something where they conveyed to you, where it sort of raised red flags to you that you thought that was probably not the best way to actually interpret the credibility of the information. I mean, did you see any patterns in that sense of things that they were expressing that you found just more credible or not, depending on?
No, actually, I intentionally.
You wouldn't try to do that as the researcher and the observer,
right.
But it could very well be that you saw patterns and things that people were queuing into that you thought were a danger for information providers, right? Professionals who are thinking about these things.
Right.
What might users be queuing into that actually aren't very good measures of credibility, but they tend to attend to a lot?
Okay, so for example, I think the design was also like a big issue. That I think that I really see that from these people because my previous study, I studied the scholars, doctoral students, and faculty members, and the way that they were judging about really the overall sites, the look and feel of the sites versus this group of people, they definitely were interested in sort of like the design issue. They came up more often, not necessarily really the content. And also the source was really interesting, was an interesting issue for the scholars, and they always constantly thinking about it. And then these people source came from time to time, but not necessarily that often. So I just see that pattern a little, since I studied the two different, quite different groups. Yes?
I was interested in your model in a different context in that if you were in a multi-user virtual environment such as Second Life, I could see a fifth layer being added of the avatarian anonymity, because what we find is that an avatar, because of the degree of self projected into the world and because of their anonymity, will go up and ask perfect strangers for information, and that's actually has found to be a very active source of information in those worlds, whereas most people will not walk up to a perfect stranger on the street and ask them for information.
Okay, that's interesting. People use something that I noticed is people use the term like a random. So it means like actually stranger. And then they were saying that I'm not going to get information just randomly. I'm not going to get just ask a random person. So it's random was almost like opposed to credible information. So I realized that sometimes credibility means actually more thoughts, more strategies, and they pay more attention on whom I'm actually getting information. So people tend to use that term just really as an opposed term. I saw another, yes.
I had a question about, I know that you said that when it was something personal, like I'm looking something up, for health reasons for my mother, or my requesting for a friend, that they tended to, double check their sources more. I was wondering how much more would you say? Like I know it's only 24 people, but how much more in depth did they go in terms of verification?
Okay, so again, that's my thesis paper where I was getting the numbers. I think it was like a 2.4 per information seeking episode. So like the different resources. I don't know how much deeper they went into. It's just kinds of different resources. Yes.
I was wondering, it seems to me that what you have observed is that rule of thumb is people are going to go places that are credible. That's going to be the first shot. So the question I have is it then more important that we look at those second-tier things? What's going to make someone move beyond their comfort level to look at something that's not in their horizon?
Okay, so I think that people have a sort of like a, when they evaluate something, what I can tell you is that people are bringing their own expectations. So people do not have the same sort of threshold for every information. They think that this is like an entertainment website. What did you expect? This is enough. Okay, I was looking for serious sort of like scholarly information, and then I know this person, and then this person's birth year is wrong. I'm not going to use this information, although this is encyclopedia information. So I think that depending on the test and depending on how much expectation they are bringing into this resource, I think that the way that people evaluate information actually differs. So that was also I found pretty interesting. Diane.
Yeah. I actually have follow-up to Larry's comment and to Dale's comment. But to Larry's comment, I'm wondering if that's like at the context level is what I would think that would be.
Well, I'm mainly talking about social inhibition. In other words, there is a vast diminishment of social inhibition in a virtual environment as opposed to the real world.
But why is that? Why do you think that actually people tend to actually trust more random people there? Because there's no way that they can really identify real.
Oh,
There's
it's
a barrier in culture to going up physically to somebody you don't know and asking them, and I don't think that barrier exists in a place like Second Life.
It just seems like that
Yeah.
environment. That's why I would think maybe it's a context, because it's in that environment that you're actually in this digital world that is allowing you to do this kind of thing.
yeah, maybe the
This
you know
kind
the
of
nature of the
information.
avatar would be part of context.
We've
I was
all had
thinking it
people
might be a
walk up
different
to
layer.
us and ask us for directions just randomly, though, right? I mean, I think or money, yeah. So, but I wonder how much of Second Life is sort of an extension of that kind of this kind of question in this kind of context. Like, here I am on campus, somebody asks me for directions to some hall. That Second Life is just an extension of that in a much larger environment.
Yeah, but a lot of it's like, I have a big bald spot on my hair. You don't. How can I fix that? And you'll ask an avatar that doesn't have a bald spot in their hair. That kind of thing,
Okay.
A context-specific problem.
I'm not sure
But so, Mike, I also wanted to push you a little bit on Deb's question, because it's kind of interesting that when you said that people, most in this case, were just going to a website. They weren't using a search engine. So if you're a person and you're using a search engine, then you actually have, there's sort of this kind of credibility judgment, I'm assuming, that you're having to exhibit when you're looking through all these websites and making decisions about which one you want to go to. And it almost seems like if they've already made a decision about which one they want to go to, they already know about it, they already have some knowledge about it, that's a different kind of thing maybe, because they've already bypassed one level of credibility, hurdles or something in order to make a decision to go to that page in the first place to begin with. So I'm wondering if you kind of talk a little bit more about that, if you think that about what was going on there.
Yeah, I think that you are exactly right. That's a really good point. And that's something that actually I found in my earlier study, that I collected data from home setting, that from that study I already found that people, it's like a search engine is a last resort. If, football, I go to NFL, weather, I go to, weather news, I go to CNN, like cooking, I know exactly where I gotta go. This is noon. I don't know where to start. Let's start with the search engine. They go to search engine, they get familiar with the website, they bookmark if the experience was really positive enough, and then they tend to go back. So that's what I found from this study, is that credibility was sometimes really embedded into their information seeking process and as a sort of strategy, and the people tend to use this credibility as a sort of shortcut to jump into one site rather than go to search engine and then go through, because then they have to think a lot, basically, right? But this site has been so good so far for the past few years, and I don't need to worry too much about credibility every single pieces. I sort of overall tend to trust information from that site, so that's why I go there. Something like that. So,
Actually, going back to Larry's point and question as well, I'm actually also wondering if there's something else besides sort of this contextual thing going on, in that it seems to me that there could be, I guess it would be different levels of importance taking place, because I'm finding it hard to believe a question that I would be willing to ask a perfect stranger on Second Life would, in my own sort of reasoning, be of the same level of importance to me as the kind of question that I would go up and ask somebody in real life about. So I'm wondering if it's not just an issue of sort of the process that's taking place in the seeking itself, as also a sort of a difference in types of goals or importance levels of goals.
I think that, whether how much actually information people get from Second Life actually they are going to actually use in their life, and how that is going to affect their sort of reputation. So like one point that I made before is like the consequences of information use. I think that maybe that is not going to be really significant in that particular context.
Well, I think you're wrong there, because the avatarian sense of the importance can become massive. People get incredibly identified with their
Really,
avatars.
they really related to.
And they will, they will be very upset, emotionally upset, if something happens to their avatar. I mean, I've seen it time and time again.
Okay.
It's not trivial to them.
Okay. I do have my second life, so I guess.
Apparently making it
Yeah.
first.
Well, I guess, getting back to, it's related to the question that I asked before, it seems like information professionals in general are kind of at an interesting spot in all of these layers because, in a way, they're driving the systems that are providing the interactions and the contexts. But in a lot of ways, we tend to attend to sources in a way that we can't assume a particular interaction. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are about, what does this mean for people who want to maintain authentic records or present collections that seem credible to people when you usually don't have the liberty of assuming a really, really specific context and interaction? Is there some way we can attend to very general constructs and heuristics in a way that we don't do so well now so that we can actually better do that interaction stuff, right? Actually promote the kinds of interactions that would be fruitful. Maybe that's too nebulous a question. It
No,
just
I
seems
think that's a really good question, but something that I really didn't think much, I guess. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that a lot of it is trying to figure out how to convey in a way that's compelling to people how things actually conform to the constructs that they already are attending to, right? And that's the challenge, because you could be maintaining somebody's birth certificate, right? And you know that this is the most definitive source to go to if you want to know when this person was born, but you realize that the kinds of cues in their everyday interactions that people attend to won't lead them there, right? And I think this is just one of the
Yeah, that's a good
challenges.
example. So, for example, birth certificate, the people are not going to really pay attention to the document because the document itself give people general idea that, this kind of certificate tend to be trustworthy. So people sort of stuck in the heuristics and really do not pay attention. Is this really real kind of thing? And then, like encyclopedia, dictionary, people really question about is it accurate information? But there are certain information, especially in this research setting, there are all kinds of different resources. So people even cannot define certain type. What kind of information is this? Then I guess that this becomes really difficult. And one thing that I also discussed with actually Beth Yeager, my colleague, is that this curation archives people, the issue always has been really only in this level, the interaction level, reliability of the documents. But I think that it's like there is some sort of a balance issue that communication people have always discussed credibility only in terms of just the perceptions. They think that everything was a perception. There's no really objectivity that this should be or this shouldn't be. But I think that as a information sort of a professional point of view, I think that it's like really, as going back to my definition, there is a certain objectivity that more or less we can say that scholarly journals or this is information from library, and then people can have a less effort, make judgment. So there is some evidence, and that tends to be a little bit objective, but still people have this subjectivity, saying that not all information is evaluated in the same way. So I guess that going back to this whole individual differences issues, I don't have a really good answer, but focusing too much on sort of documents and just assuming that this is a like a really authentic document and that people must evaluate this information as authentic versus people actually accepting the fact that people actually have a completely different ways of evaluating information. I think that that's just like a balance that information professionals need to pay attention a little.
So there may have been a couple more questions, but I want to stop now because it is 4:30. And I want to remind you that master's students have an opportunity to speak with the speaker tomorrow from 11 to 12 in